Hello friends, welcome back to Cosmopolitan Cornbread. So today I thought I would do something a little bit fun with y'all. So I mentioned a while back, I did a video where I talked about a great lesson that I learned from a vintage cookbook. And I had several people asking me about what cookbook was this that had all of these tips. And the particular tip that I shared there was about having a household schedule for your chores, all of the things that you do to maintain your home, and how that was such a life-changing tip for me as a young mom. Well, that really got me thinking about the cookbook. I remembered what it looked like. I remembered that it was a Betty Crocker cookbook, and I decided to go on a hunt, and I found one right here. Now, I went on a search on Etsy, which is kind of like one of my favorite places to look for things, and I remembered what the cookbook looked like. I remembered the color block style of the cover and everything, and I saw a few of these actually for sale on Etsy in varying prices. I know there was one that was several $100s, but there was something about this one in particular that as soon as I saw it, I knew it was the one. When you look at the edge of the cookbook, do you see what I see? I see things in this cookbook just like my grandmother's. Notes, newspaper clippings, and everything else, which told me this was a well-loved, well-used cookbook, and I knew this would be a treasure. And it's even got some burn marks on the back cover where it got a little too close to the stove. So I thought it would be really fun to kind of walk through this cookbook a little bit and kind of go through this so that you can see some of the great things that I found in here. Alright, so first of all, one of the things that I always remembered about this cookbook was this. And I think every spiral-bound cookbook, or book for that matter, ought to come with one of these. It has one of these in the front and the back. And what this thing does is, if you've ever had a 3-ring binder full of pages and you're open to the middle of the book, and then you go to close it, how all of those pages get kind of crammed up underneath these rings, this prevents that from happening, so that when the cookbook is open and you go to close it, it just moves all of the pages out of there so that the cookbook can close easily. And it has it in the front and in the back. And like I said, I think this should be mandatory for every kind of spiral bound or ring bound cookbook or any other book. So this cookbook is the Betty Crocker's New Picture Cookbook. And this was the first edition, but this was the 4th printing. I'm wondering if those ones that I saw for several $100s, if maybe those were a first printing, first edition of this book. But in any case, this was printed, copyrighted in 1961 by the General Mills Company. And you can tell that this was a period type of cookbook because of all of the artwork. I always remembered this very 50s-ish artwork, which 1961 would be just, you know, completing that era. But right here on this very first, like, main page, the very first section divider, you'll see all of these hints for the homemaker. And the very first one, if you can see it, says plan ahead. Write menus for a week's meals at a time. Shop for staples once a week. Fresh fruits and vegetables twice weekly. When cooking, assemble all the ingredients and utensils before beginning to prepare the dish. If you have a freezer, make several cakes, pies, cookies, main dishes, or sandwiches at a time, and freeze some for future use. See the freezer information on these pages. But that very first sentence, write menus for a week's meal at a time, that's where I got that idea, y'all. And like I said, that was so incredibly helpful for a young mom. So that tip right there was what also inspired me to begin menu planning. That is when I started doing my menus. I started making my grocery list from that. And this is what inspired me to make the printable that I have for that on my website. And then right over here on the other side of the page in the next column, you see the other thing, organize work. Have a weekly plan for scheduling each tasks as washing, ironing, baking, shopping, cleaning the refrigerator or washing floors. One task done each day provides a sense of accomplishment and keeps work from piling up. Y'all, this was what inspired me to do my home chores plan, my schedule for the weekly homemaker tasks, which I did that video about. And these two right here, the menu and the home tasks, were just incredibly helpful for me as a young mom. And that is what inspired those two things that I've done for years and years. Alright, so all through this cookbook, as I was thumbing through this, I saw all sorts of notes all over the place. Whoever owned this cookbook, and man, I wish I knew what her name was. She was clearly an avid cook. She did all sorts of cooking and baking, and she added countless pages to this cookbook. So here you can see something that she probably got out of a magazine somewhere and had a guide for measuring different ingredients and equivalents and things like that. And then all through it, we've got cutouts from newspapers and magazines all over the place in here. You know, right here you can see not only did she add a page into the cookbook, but then she also wrote all sorts of notes. Here she has instructions on doing blanched almonds, about doing roasted blanched almonds. She had her little notes on how to do these things. And then I want to turn and show you a couple of others. For instance, right here on this page, there's a recipe for an applesauce cake. Now she was very particular about keeping notes, making notes to herself, and really the notes that she did were so diligent and so detailed. You know, she could have been doing this for her kids or her grandkids to inherit this cookbook and learn from her down the road. And it's kind of sad that, you know, I found this being sold somewhere and this wasn't treasured by someone else in her family, but it will definitely be treasured in my kitchen. So right here on November 2nd, 1977, she made this recipe. She said it's good and it's easy, and if the applesauce is very wet, to omit the water, that the mixture should be thick but not dry. And then down here, she made notes about which pan to use and the baking time. And then down at the very bottom where it says to press things through a sieve or a food mill, she says it's not necessary if the water is drained off thoroughly. So, you know, all of these different notes that she has all through this cookbook. Here's a page where she added some loose leaf paper and just taped in different things that she had saved, different recipes. Over here is a recipe for divinity. She said on December 23rd, 1980, easy. The key is making sure you do as underlined. And she made a note of underlining a particular instruction in here. And it was basically to make sure you don't under or overbeat the egg whites. what every cook needs to know about cookies. You know, like I said, this particular cookbook was so full of tips and how-tos. You know, such a great resource for a new mom, a new cook, especially, you know, before the days of the internet. It wasn't a thing back then. If you wanted to learn new recipes, you needed cookbooks, you needed, or magazines, or something along those lines. Now this one in particular, you can see I left my little post-it note there because I wanted to make sure I mentioned this page. This was a recipe for pineapple upside down cake, which, by the way, was my favorite cake my entire life. My mom, when I had her make me a birthday cake, it was always pineapple upside down cake. And then, you know, several years ago, I developed an allergy to pineapple, which broke my heart, y'all. But whoever made this recipe, whoever owned this cookbook, she made this recipe several times because she's got several notes here about making it. First, in 1983, she said, "Easy to make, a little doughy or heavy, try again." In May 1984, she wrote, "Still a little doughy/heavy." And then she made it again in March of 92. Perfect. She said, "Sift the flour first before measuring and don't overmix the batter." And then down here she had highlighted several different instructions so that she would remember things. And right here she made a note where it says to turn the cake over immediately. She says otherwise the cake would crack when you invert the cake. So I thought that was kind of neat that here she was making these several notations throughout the years on what was my favorite cake growing up. But so many recipes, so many notes, and like I said, it is, to me, it's just such a treasure to find something like this. And while sure I could have gotten a version of this cookbook that was in pristine condition and looked like brand new, finding something like this that was well loved, well used, and has all sorts of notes throughout it, just like my own cookbooks, I love this so much more. So that is it, friends. I just thought you might like taking a look at this old cookbook, the one that had inspired me so many years ago. This is the cookbook that I basically taught myself how to cook with as a teenager, a little bit here and there. This is the same cookbook that I borrowed from my friend in Germany, which again was the only way you could learn new recipes back then. You know, borrowing cookbooks from friends was a great way to do it. Otherwise there was newspapers, you know, there used to be cooking sections in those, or magazines. You didn't have things like cosmopolitancornbread.com. So that is it for today, friends. Thank you for joining me here again at the homestead. My name is Constance from Cosmopolitan Cornbread. God bless, and I'll talk to y'all next time.